On the evening of December 16, 1773, Boston was unusually tense. The winter air was sharp, the harbor waters dark and still, and the streets filled with whispers rather than noise. Ordinary citizens moved with purpose, yet nothing about the night appeared extraordinary to an outside observer. British soldiers stood watch, merchant ships rocked gently at anchor, and the city seemed to settle into another cold colonial evening. But beneath this calm surface, history was preparing to turn. By midnight, an act would take place that would not only ignite a revolution, but unsettle empires across the globe. For years, American colonists had lived under British rule with growing frustration. Taxes were rising, laws were tightening, and decisions affecting colonial life were being made thousands of miles away by men who would never set foot on American soil. The cry of no taxation without representation was not just a slogan, it was a declaration of identity, dignity, and resistance. Still, few imagined that resistance would take the form it did that night. This was not a riot born of chaos or desperation. It was deliberate, controlled, and symbolic. As darkness deepened, small groups of men gathered quietly along the waterfront. Their faces were darkened, their clothing rough, many disguised as Mohawk Native Americans. This disguise was more than camouflage. It was a statement and assertion that they no longer saw themselves as British subjects, but as something new. One by one, they boarded 3 British ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Each ship was loaded with tea, the lifeblood of British commerce and the symbol of imperial authority. What followed was astonishing in its discipline. Chests of tea were broken open and dumped into the harbor with methodical precision. No other cargo was touched, no sailors were harmed. No personal property was stolen. When a lock was broken accidentally, it was replaced. This was not mob violence, it was a message. By dawn, 342 chests of tea lay dissolved in the freezing waters of Boston Harbor. News of the event traveled fast. In Boston, some celebrated quietly, while others feared retaliation. In London, shock quickly turned to rage. The British Empire had been openly humiliated not by an army, but by civilians. The damage was not just financial, it was psychological. If colonists could do this without fear, what could they do next? And more importantly, who else was watching? Across the Atlantic, rival powers paid close attention. France, still bitter from its losses to Britain in previous wars, saw opportunity. Spain and the Netherlands saw warning signs. The Boston Tea Party was not merely a protest, it was proof that empire could be resisted. And once that idea existed, it could never be undone. To understand why the Boston Tea Party mattered so deeply, one must understand the world of the 18th century. This was an age of empires. Power was measured in colonies, trade routes, and naval strength. Britain stood at the top of this global order. Its ships dominated the seas, its merchants controlled markets, and its laws extended across continents. The American colonies were not just territories. They were essential engines of wealth. Colonies existed to serve the mother country. Raw materials flowed out, finished goods flowed in, and profits returned to imperial capitals. This system required obedience. Any challenge to authority threatened not just a single colony, but the entire structure of empire. That is why rebellion, even symbolic rebellion, was treated as an existential threat. The American colonies were especially valuable. They provided timber for ships, crops for trade, and a growing market for British goods. But they were also distant and difficult to control. Communication took months. Enforcement relied on local cooperation. Britain assumed loyalty, but loyalty was beginning to crack. Other empires faced similar challenges. France ruled territories in the Caribbean and beyond. Spain controlled vast lands in the Americas. The Netherlands depended heavily on global trade. All watched Britain closely, learning from its successes and its failures. If Britain lost control of its colonies, it would send a dangerous signal to oppressed peoples everywhere. The Boston Tea Party did exactly that. It exposed a vulnerability. It showed that imperial authority relied not just on force, but on consent. And once consent was withdrawn, even the strongest empire could be shaken. At the heart of the crisis was a law many people misunderstand, the Tea Act of 1773. Contrary to popular belief, It did not raise taxes on tea. In fact, it made tea cheaper in the colonies. But this was precisely the problem. The act granted the British East India Company a monopoly, allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies without colonial merchants as middlemen. The British government believed it was solving two problems at once: saving the East India Company from bankruptcy and reaffirming Parliament's right to tax the colonies. What they failed to understand was perception. To colonists, the Tea Act was a trap. By accepting cheaper tea, they would be accepting Parliament's authority to tax them without representation. The East India Company was not just a business. It was a symbol of imperial exploitation. It controlled vast territories in India, commanded its own armies, and operated with government backing. To many colonists, allowing this company to dominate colonial trade was surrender. Protests erupted across the colonies. Ships carrying tea were turned away from ports. Merchants refused to unload cargo, but Boston was different. Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted the tea be unloaded and the tax paid. The standoff lasted weeks, escalating tensions until compromise became impossible. The stage was set for confrontation, and everyone involved knew it. Britain believed the colonies would eventually submit. The colonies believed resistance was the only option left. The Boston Tea Party did not happen spontaneously. It was organized by a network of activists known as the Sons of Liberty. At their center was Samuel Adams, a man often remembered as a rabble-rouser, but in reality a master strategist. Adams understood the power of symbolism. He knew that words alone would not move history. Action was required. Meetings were held in secret. Plans were discussed quietly. Messages were coded. The decision to disguise themselves as Mohawk Native Americans was both practical and symbolic. It provided anonymity, but it also rejected British identity. This was a declaration that they were no longer subjects, they were something new. Participation required courage. The penalties for treason were severe, yet dozens stepped forward not knowing what the consequences would be. They understood that once the tea was destroyed, there would be no turning back. British officials suspected organized resistance almost immediately. The precision of the act made it clear this was not random, and foreign observers reached the same conclusion. This was not chaos, this was coordination. As the last chest of tea hit the water, silence fell over the harbor. The men disappeared into the night. By morning, the damage was undeniable. The water itself seemed stained with rebellion. The reaction in Britain was swift and furious. Newspapers called for punishment. Parliament demanded obedience. The question was no longer whether to respond, but how harshly. To do nothing would invite rebellion elsewhere. Meanwhile, across Europe, reactions were mixed. Some mocked Britain's loss of control. Others feared the example it set. Monarchs understood that if people believed they could challenge authority, revolutions would follow. France watched closely. Though not yet ready to openly support rebellion, French leaders saw an opportunity to weaken Britain. Secret aid began to flow. Spain and the Netherlands monitored events cautiously, balancing fear and opportunity. The Boston Tea Party became a case study in resistance. It demonstrated that protest could be powerful without violence. That idea was dangerous. Britain responded with the intolerable acts. Boston Harbor was closed. Self-government was restricted, troops were sent. The goal was clear: make an example of Boston. Instead, Britain achieved the opposite. Sympathy spread. Colonies united, resistance hardened. What was meant as punishment became a catalyst. The Boston Tea Party led directly to revolution. Shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Empires shifted. Ideas spread. The belief that people could challenge power took root across the world. What began as tea in a harbor became a turning point in human history. And that is why, centuries later, powerful nations still remember and fear the lesson of that night.